The galaxy knew Worlds 7 as one of the most hostile planets ever documented. Its atmosphere was dense and acidic, shredded by winds strong enough to tear metal apart. The flora was a nightmare of thorns and toxins, while the fauna consisted of massive predators and camouflage creatures with insatiable appetites. Even the most seasoned alien observers, members of the Galactic Coalition, kept their distance, monitoring the planet only from the safety of orbital stations. Through this chaotic, deadly world, something extraordinary unfolded. A lone escape pod, battered and scorched, pierced the corrosive atmosphere and crash-landed in a valley of searing geysers and jagged black mountains. The observers watched, in stunned silence as a human, a so-called Deathworlder, emerged from the wreckage. His movements were deliberate despite his evident struggle to breathe. Adjusting a damaged oxygen mask, he scanned his surroundings, pulling rudimentary tools from the shattered remains of the pod. "He won't last a day," muttered Likari, a Vroxian with translucent skin and multifaceted eyes that shimmered in hues of concern. His slender frame leaned closer to the monitor, antennae twitching as he scrutinized the screen. "Watch and learn, Likari," Kalen replied, an experienced veteran whose tone carried both intrigue and skepticism. His hands adjusted the holovisor, enhancing the image of the human. "They always surprise us." The human coughed into his mask but didn't falter. Instead, he set to work, his hands moving with a purpose that defied the chaos around him. The alien observers watched, transfixed, as he began to gather debris from the pod and assess the resources of the hostile terrain. Far from being overwhelmed, he seemed to be calculating, adapting, and most importantly, surviving. The first thing the human did was find shelter. He located a crevice in a jagged volcanic rock formation near a field of hissing acid geysers. The wind screamed through the valley, carrying flecks of corrosive particles that glimmered like shards of glass. Without hesitation, the human dragged pieces of the escape pod wreckage to the crevice, creating a makeshift barrier against the deadly elements. Inside, he worked tirelessly to carve out a livable space, using sharp fragments of metal and his bare hands to shape the rock walls into something resembling a crude shelter. The observers in the orbital station watched in stunned fascination. Likari leaned closer to the monitor, his shimmering eyes blinking in a rapid sequence of disbelief. This is impossible. He's using local materials. Does he even know how dangerous they are?" Kalen let out a quiet chuckle, the sound reverberating through the sterile observation deck. "That's not luck, Likari. That's what they do, they adapt." The human wasn't merely surviving, he was creating. With fibers pulled from thorny, toxin-laden plants, he crafted rudimentary insulation. From shards of blackened rock, he built a small furnace to generate heat, its glow flickering like a fragile beacon in the hostile darkness. He fashioned tools, crude but effective, from scraps of metal, then began scavenging his surroundings, with a sharp, methodical focus. Hours later, the human approached a bubbling, toxic lake. The liquid shimmered with iridescent colors, a clear warning of its lethal properties. Yet he crouched by the edge, observing small, crustacean-like creatures that darted through the poisonous waters. With improvised tools, he managed to capture a few, bringing them back to his shelter. There he used his makeshift furnace to cook the creatures, carefully removing their shells and filtering out the toxins with a charcoal-based filter he had constructed from charred plant matter. Likari sat back, his translucent skin flushing, with a faint purple hue of amazement. "He's not just surviving," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's thriving." Kalen nodded slowly, his expression unreadable as he continued to observe the human's relentless ingenuity. And this is just the beginning. Days passed, and the human's efforts to fortify his shelter began to take shape. He worked tirelessly, constructing a wall of reinforced debris around the crevice to protect his newfound home from both the elements and the predatory dangers of Worlds 7. The winds howled incessantly, but he moved with purpose, his every action calculated and efficient. Then one evening, a sound shattered the monotonous roar of the wind, a deep resonating growl that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. The human froze, his makeshift hammer still in hand. Slowly, he turned toward the source of the sound. Emerging from the dense, jagged underbrush was a creature of nightmarish proportions. It stood on 6 powerful legs, its body a grotesque hybrid of an insect and a predator, with glistening black scales that exuded wisps of toxic vapor. Its eyes glowed an unnatural amber, locked onto the human with an unnerving intensity. As it opened its massive jaws, revealing rows of serrated teeth, the creature let out a guttural roar that echoed through the valley. In the orbital station, Likari's translucent skin shimmered with pale yellow streaks of panic. This is it. He's done for. That thing is unstoppable. Kalen, though outwardly calm, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Watch him. The human didn't run. Instead, he moved deliberately, retreating a few steps to lead the creature toward a section of the rocky terrain where he had prepared a series of traps. The observers watched with bated breath as the human evaded the creature's thunderous charge, narrowly dodging its snapping jaws and massive claws. His movements were fluid, almost instinctual, as though he had been studying the predator's behavior all along. The creature lunged again, its immense body slamming into the ground where the human had been moments earlier. With a sharp crack, the earth beneath it gave way, revealing a pit lined with sharpened stakes. The creature howled in pain, thrashing violently as the stakes pierced its armored hide. But it wasn't finished. The human darted to a nearby ridge, where he had rigged an explosive device from chemicals scavenged from his escape pod. He triggered the device just as the creature freed itself from the pit. A deafening explosion rocked the valley, and when the smoke cleared, the predator lay motionless, its body crumpled at the base of the ridge. In the station, Likari's antennae trembled, his voice barely a whisper. He took it down, alone. Kalen exhaled slowly, his usual sharp tongue replaced by quiet admiration. This is why they call them Deathworlders. They don't just survive, they conquer. The human stood over the fallen creature for a moment, breathing heavily before salvaging what he could from its body, tools, materials, even its toxic scales, which he carefully stored for future use. As he returned to his shelter, the valley fell silent once more, save for the eerie hum of the wind. Yet, in the minds of the observers, a new sound echoed, the quiet realization that this human was far more dangerous than the world he had been stranded on. The human's shelter had grown into something more than a mere refuge. It was becoming a fortress. Walls reinforced with scavenged debris and natural materials stood firm against the relentless winds. Inside, he had constructed a small filtration system to purify the acidic water from nearby geysers. His tools were no longer rudimentary. They were refined, crafted from both the wreckage of his escape pod and the remains of the predator he had defeated. Each day brought new innovations, and the watchers in the orbital station could barely keep up. One evening, the human worked on a device near the entrance of his shelter, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a makeshift energy lamp. From scraps of wires and bioelectric components harvested from the creature's remains, he was assembling what appeared to be a transmitter. The observers leaned closer to their monitors as sparks flickered from the crude machine, a signal pulsing faintly into the dark skies of Worlds 7. Likari's multifaceted eyes widened as the station's instruments began picking up fragments of a signal. "He's trying to communicate," he said, his voice filled with both disbelief and curiosity. But how? His pod's systems were destroyed in the crash. Kalen studied the screen, his expression unreadable. "Look closer. He's not just repairing old tech, he's creating something new." The signal was faint and fragmented, but its complexity was undeniable. The human had somehow developed a unique frequency, weaving together parts of his pod's damaged systems and the bioelectric properties of the planet's life forms. The result was a transmission that reached the station, albeit in bursts of static and broken patterns. Inside the shelter, the human adjusted the device, his brow furrowed in concentration. A flicker of light on his face hinted at hope, though, tempered by the weight of his isolation. He stepped back, observing the device as it emitted another pulse. In the station, Likari and Kalen worked to decode the message, their systems struggling to interpret the human's improvisation. "It's incredible," Likari muttered, his translucent skin shimmering with a soft green glow of astonishment. He's using a mixture of chemical reactions and electrical pulses to amplify the signal. I've never seen anything like it. Kalen nodded, his usual skepticism giving way to genuine admiration. He's turning this hostile world into an asset, but he knows help won't come quickly. He's planning for the long haul. As the human continued to fine-tune his transmitter, a faint smile flickered across his face. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but one of quiet determination. The watchers could see it clearly, a man who refused to be broken, who was transforming despair into ingenuity. But as the human stepped outside to test the range of his transmission, the night's silence was broken by an ominous rumble. A glow emerged from the horizon, faint at first but growing steadily brighter. Likari's antennae quivered as he stared at the monitors. "That's not natural," he said, his voice tinged with alarm. Kalen leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "No, that's a storm, and it's headed straight for him." The storm rolled across the horizon like an unstoppable tide, its dark churning clouds illuminated by flashes of green and blue lightning. The winds howled, carrying acidic rain that sizzled against the jagged rocks of Worlds 7's surface. The human stood at the entrance of his shelter, his eyes fixed on the approaching tempest. For a moment, he was still, the glow of his makeshift transmitter casting a faint light on his determined face. In the orbital station, Likari's voice was almost a whisper, his translucent skin shifting to a pale blue of worry. "He can't survive that. The storm's energy levels are off the charts." Kalen clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the edge of the console. "If anyone can, it's him. Watch." The human moved quickly, securing the walls of his shelter, with additional reinforcements made from scavenged metal and natural materials. He redirected the output of his furnace into a ventilation system, creating a warm pocket of breathable air inside the shelter. As the first gusts of the storm hit, the structure groaned but held firm. The human worked tirelessly, adjusting the transmitter, his eyes narrowing as he focused on stabilizing the signal. The storm descended, and the shelter was engulfed in darkness and chaos. Lightning struck the ground around it, sending waves of electric energy rippling through the terrain. Inside, the human huddled next to his transmitter, shielding it with his body as he made final adjustments. Sparks flew, and the device emitted a steady pulse of light, its signal reaching farther than before. In the station, Kalen and Likari monitored the data stream. "He's amplifying the signal using the storm's energy," Likari said, awe coloring his voice. "He's using the planet itself as a power source." Kalen nodded, his expression grim but impressed. "He's not just surviving, he's turning the storm into an ally." The storm raged for hours, testing the limits of the shelter. Acid, rain hissed against the walls and the winds roared like a living beast. Yet as the storm finally began to subside, the shelter stood intact. Inside, the human sat beside his transmitter, his face streaked with sweat and soot, but his expression was calm. The device emitted a clear, strong signal, its pulse cutting through the static of the atmosphere. On the monitors, Likari's eyes widened as he decoded the message. He sent coordinates and a status report. It's concise, efficient. He's asking for extraction. Kalen leaned back, a faint smile breaking through his normally stoic demeanor. He's ready. Let's hope the galaxy is ready for him. Days later, a rescue ship descended onto Worlds 7, its searchlights cutting through the lingering haze of the storm. The crew approached the shelter cautiously, their boots crunching against the toxic ground. What they found left them speechless. The human had transformed the barren, hostile landscape into a fully functioning survival outpost. There were water filtration systems, cultivated food sources, and even a defensive perimeter equipped with weapons fashioned from the planet's resources. The human emerged from his shelter, standing tall despite the weeks of hardship. His clothes were tattered, his face weathered, but his gaze was steady. As the crew stared in awe, he smirked faintly and gestured toward his transmitter. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice calm but tinged with humor. "I was starting to get comfortable here." In the orbital station, Likari and Kalen watched the scene in silence. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Likari shook his head, his voice filled with quiet wonder. Deathworlders. They don't just survive, they thrive. Kalen nodded, his gaze never leaving the screen. And they rewrite the rules while doing it,